Thank you for attending this webinar of the cross-border data transfer in China. We will discuss the laws and practices, and we will also cover the latest trend of the enforcement and provide you some roadmap of the next steps. As a matter of fact, we have been monitoring and advising clients on the regulatory developments and practice of the cross-border data transfer in the past 18 months. The past 18 months are very important for the development of the PRC personal information protection laws. During this period, Chinese authorities have actually materialized their requirements and started enforcing the law. Therefore, I believe it is a very good time to summarize the status of law and regulations, and also more practical reactions that the multinational companies need to do. As to myself, and I have 18 years experience in law and technology. I am a certified information privacy manager, and I'm admitted both in China and the States. I was a key member of China's first state-sponsored research project on protection of personal information. I have then moved to the private practice and worked in a large international firm's Hong Kong office for 7 years. Then I joined a leading fintech unicorn company and have overseen the group's data-related legal matters across more than 12 jurisdictions in the region of Asia Pacific. After China promulgates the Personal Information Protection Law, which is PIPL, I worked with companies to prepare for cross-border compliant documents and have provided practical advices given a fast-developing regulatory environment. So in the next 1 hour, I would like to cover the following topics. The first one is the regulatory framework that are related to the cross-border transfer of the data. The second one would be introduction of the general rule over the data export. And I will try to define a data export under the PRC law, which is slightly different in other jurisdictions. The fourth one is I want to jump into the practice and tell you about the enforcement focuses by the authorities and regulators in China. Lastly, I would like to draw a roadmap along with you after we have learned all these kind of knowledges and information. Okay, so the first part is regulatory framework. During the past decade, China promulgated a series of laws and regulations governing use of data. Among them, the most important 3 laws are: first, the cybersecurity law; second, the data security law; and third, the personal information protection law, or PIPL. The cybersecurity law was implemented in 2017. It actually introduced a concept of critical information infrastructure, CII. Operators of CIIs are required to go through data security reviews by government authorities before they can transmit any data outside of China. So this is CII. The second law, the data security law, introduces another key concept, which is data classification, by which the classes of core data and important data are required to be stored in China. However, the law did not clearly define what constitutes the core data or the important data. It basically designated the government authorities to define them. This, as we will discuss later, opened the Pandora's box of a wide and discretionary restrictions over the data export. Lastly, the Personal Information Protection Law is a GDPR-style legislation particularly made to regulate the collection, use, transfer, or otherwise processing of the personal information. In addition to the laws promulgated by the National People's Congress, China relies on lower-level administrative regulations to govern the cross-border transmission and other data processing activities. These regulations are issued by various government agencies at the Beijing, the central or provincial or municipal levels. These administrative regulations play a crucial role in the actual practice of the data compliance. For transmission of the personal data, the following 3 pieces of regulations are more important than others. The first one is measures on recordal of standard contractual clauses for cross-border transfer of personal information. This regulation was published for public comments in June 2022, last year. So we can briefly call it the SCC measures. It also proposed a full set of the standard contractual clauses to be compulsorily used between data providers and data receivers. The second one is measures on security assessment of cross-border data transfer. The third one is a guideline on how to prepare and submit the applications for the cross-border data transfer to be reviewed by the regulators. In addition to this central government's regulations, some provinces like Jiangsu, Hainan province have recently released their own respective guidelines on how to file applications for the cross-border security assessment. Further to the general administrative regulations, there are also some sector-specific regulations. Say, for example, under the banking and finance regulators' scope, they have their own administrative regulations. There are also automobile data to be collected and used by the automobiles. There are also regulations governing the human gene, transfer of the human gene data, and there are also serving and mapping regulations. The framework is over there. So what are the rules? Before we jump into the details, we should sit back and look at what are the Chinese government's ultimate purposes in making so many regulations that I've just mentioned. Briefly, there are two main purposes behind these regulations. The first one is the national security, as well as the security of the existing political, economic, and cultural regime. For this purpose, if a data controller collects huge amount of data, or its data can be used to threaten the Chinese government's operation, then such data controller will face stricter compliance requirements. The second purpose, we have to admit, is to restore or rectify the market order. Chinese government use data laws as a visible hand to balance the stakeholders in the market. Because of this purpose, the government wishes to prevent excessive data collection and wishes to know how the data is processed and where the data will be transferred. Therefore, the government's enforcement resources will be more likely used in anti-unfair competition and consumer protection activities. Although the Chinese law provided that if there is a bilateral or multinational treaty providing green lights to cross-border data transmission, then such treaty should apply. However, and unfortunately, there is no such treaty exists now. On the other hand, the Chinese law also provides that China will apply the so-called reciprocal principle for data export restrictions. However, this position is indeed a very vague and unpractical one. The third way of international collaboration under the PRC law would be the whitelist regime. Namely, the government may recognize that certain countries' law have reached similar level of protection to the personal information, or those laws have provided adequate protection. This is sort of the GDPR approach. Under the GDPR regime, if European Union believes that a country has provided so-called adequate level of protection, then the data can be freely flowing into that country. Unfortunately, China has not fully adopted this approach. Some provincial and municipal regulations like Shanghai and Shenzhen have used this concept and may provide a whitelist of the countries. But such whitelist may still be subject to the type of data, the volume of data, and other conditions. The Personal Information Protection Law, Data Security Law, and the Cybersecurity Law provided the following general principles for the cross-border data transfer. Firstly, the core data under the Data Security Law which are usually data relating to national security or military data, these kind of core data are prohibited to be transmitted out of China. Second, the so-called important data under the data security law and the data of critical information infrastructure under the cybersecurity law are by default not allowed to be transmitted out of China. Meanwhile, they may be transmitted after approval of the government authority. The approving process is called cross-border data security review. Thirdly, for the other data, they are by default allowed to be transmitted out of China. Let's go back to the definition or the concept of the core data and important data. Briefly speaking, the core data are extremely confidential and important data sets, usually related to military and national security data. So foreign companies would hardly be a controller of those core data. However, foreign companies may be processing important data from time to time. According to the released guidelines and regulations, the following data can be identified to be the important data by regulators. Say, for example, certain geographic data close to the military sites, certain data sets of natural resources, the data about the population of the Chinese people or certain province, and the data about the environment facts. Also, the classified government data and military information are, of course, the core data or important data. The regulators also extended the important data to any database involving more than 100,000 people. This effectively connected the personal data protection law to the data security law. Also, in a regulation specially provided for the automobile data, the car charging information and the map of car chargers, as well as the facial images collected by the cars, are by default deemed important data. Under the PIPL, in addition to receiving the data subject's consents, data providers are burdened statutory obligations before they can lawfully send personal data to a foreign data receiver. These kind of obligations or compliant options include, first, seeking approval by the regulatory body after conducting cross-border data security review. Second, you may also obtain a certification by a certifier appointed by the regulator. Thirdly, the law also allows you to reach a data transfer agreement with each data receiver by using the standard contractual clauses. That clauses has been drafted and published by the regulator. So the third topic of our webinar would be, what is the so-called data export under the PRC law? First of all, we need to clarify the concepts between data localization and data export. Data localization means the company shall store data within a country's territory. There are two kinds of data localization. The first is absolute localized data, which means the data shall only be stored in a country's territory and no copies or backup of the data can be stored outside of that country. The second one is, we can call it relative data localization, which requires at least one copy of the data being stored in a country, but there can be copies or backup data stored outside of that country. On the other hand, even if some data has been complying with the existing data localization requirement, they are not necessarily be prohibited from transferring to other countries. So these are two systems, and companies should observe both the regulations about the data localization and about the data export.